Good morning, good afternoon. We would appreciate it if you could wait a little bit longer while other participants join. We will give them a few moments before we start. Thanks. Okay, we can see that many participants have joined already, so we shall start now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Buenos Aires, wherever you are. Today is September 16, 2020. My name is Leandro Passarella. I'm a tax lawyer and professor of basic income taxation at UTDT's Masters of Tax Law program. I'm with Professor Celina Valls. Hello, Celina.
Hello, Leandro. Hello, everyone. We are pleased to be back to our fourth edition of the UTDT Global Tax Talks. Leandro, could you please explain what this entails?
Yes. As we have said in previous talks, UTDT has three mottos: academic excellence, pluralism, and equal opportunity. UTDT Global Tax Talks is a platform fostering an interdisciplinary dialogue based on these mottos among scholars and faculty members from all continents on a single hard tax topic. Based on a common questionnaire, tax law professors, economists, and political scientists will share their views on the same issue, offering the audience a comprehensive analysis. In its first edition, UTDT Global Tax Talks is covering the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the international tax system. We have a roster of 10 recognized scholars. So far, we have already conversed with three of them: Professor Avillona, Professor Sean, and Professor Valls Moreno. North America, Europe and India, and continental Europe have been represented already. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Eduardo Baistrocchi from Argentina.
Thank you. Eduardo Baistrocchi is Associate Professor of Law at the London School of Economics, as well as at UTDT in Buenos Aires. He has an LLM at Harvard Law School and a tax degree from LSE. He has been a Fulbright Scholar as well as a Chevening Scholar. He has also been distinguished visiting professor in Brazil, Canada, University of Toronto, and the United States, Northwestern University. His research and publication are focused on international taxation, with a particular emphasis on tax treaty disputes in the G20. He applies interdisciplinary approach such as the game theory and public choice to investigate how the international tax regime operates. He has published in leading journals and publishing houses such as the British Tax Review, Global Tax Treaty Commentaries, Virginia Tax Review, the Modern Law Review, the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, and Cambridge University Press. His Oxford Journal of Legal Study piece is considered one of the most important papers published in the last 2 decades on all continents. He is the principal author and editor of the first treatise offering a global analysis of tax treaty disputes in the G20 and beyond within the first century of international taxation. Professor Baistrocchi, welcome to the UTDT Global Tax Talks.
All right. Thank you very much, Maria, Celina, Valls, and Leandro Passarella for this wonderful opportunity and for this fantastic idea of Global Tax Talks.
Thank you, Eduardo. It is a pleasure for us to have you here. And And thanks for participating and all your support for this project.
Thank you very
Before starting with our presentation, today's presentation, unfortunately, there is no skip intro button for this introduction that I'm going to give, but just to give a brief comment of what we are doing so far, okay, in the context. We all know that in December 2019, a coronavirus appeared on our human world. Since then, it has silently spread using human beings and their advances in technologies as means of transportation. Nowadays, coronavirus is an uninvited guest in our lives and is everywhere. And human beings cannot see it or detect it before its unsettling presence becomes real, once it has already infected human beings, jeopardizing their lives. Governments initially reacted to the virus spread, requesting us or directly requiring us to remain at home, okay? Disrupting our normal lives. Borders were closed, planes were grounded. We cannot move far from our places of residence, and if we do, in many cases, we are required to comply with a preventive quarantine. We live very much as if we were characters of a science fiction book, until an effective vaccine is designed to allow us to get back to normal or the pandemic fades away naturally. Human beings will continue to be pushed to transform our lifestyles. This transformation includes the ways in which we do business. Social distancing is now the rule, and electronic commerce is widespread. Everything is delivered to our doors or screens, and this behavior will likely remain once we learn to coexist with the pandemic. If we change the way we do business, this for sure has tax implications. So far, governments have used tactics and tools already known to them to deal with these pandemic effects on their countries' economies, and their long-term results are uncertain. In UTDT Global Tax Talks, we will discuss various tax issues derived from the challenges that COVID-19 poses to human beings' economic relations, and how states could deal with them effectively to continue generating revenues to provide the essential services that human beings expect to receive from them. For that purpose, Celina and I have prepared a set of questions that was sent to the speakers in anticipation to our dialogues. We don't know their answers yet, as you know, but we will listen to them attentively to provide our conclusions on November 11. Before starting with our questionnaire, today, Professor Baistrocchi will give us an introduction offering a theory of international taxation for our consideration. Professor Baistrocchi, the floor is yours.
Leandro, thank you very much. I would like to organize my presentation as follows. I would like to say a couple of words regarding how my presentation relates to the presentation submitted by the previous prominent speakers. Then I would like to say what is, I think, the global context of international taxation that we need to take into account in order to answer your 7 very challenging questions. Then I would like to outline a theory of international taxation in the light of competition law, of antitrust law. And finally, I would like to offer my responses to your 7 questions. As you know, I mean, all speakers in the current edition of the UTDT Global Tax Talks, we are dealing with the same questions, but we are using different approaches. For example, Professor Ruben S. Avillona fundamentally used a historical perspective in order to answer these 7 questions. Professor Partosham offers an economic perspective to answer these questions. And thirdly, Professor Andres Baez Moreno offered a doctrinal perspective. What I will try to do today is to use a 4th perspective based on antitrust law, on the assumption that countries are increasingly behaving like companies since at least the 60s. So in relation to the context, if we take a look at the last 200 centuries, we will be able to see that there have been 3 globalization booms and 3 busts. the first globalization, that is normally called the Concept of Europe system, started after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 until 1914, the starting point of the First World War. The second globalization was pretty short, just 10 years, the League of Nations system. It lasted since the end of the First World War until the New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929. The international tax system was fundamentally devised in the second globalization. Then came the second bust, World War II. And after that, the third globalization started on 1946 until about 2015, when emerging and developing countries starting producing over 50% of the global GDP, as it was the case before the first industrial revolution. So this UTDT Global Tax Symposium is being delivered in something that I would call the third bust. That is to say, a period between the end of the third globalization and before the still distant fourth globalization boom. And the third bust is fundamentally triggered by COVID-19, which is, I think, comparable to World War I and World War II, at least in terms of the economic damage that COVID-19 is producing to global economies. So COVID-19 to plunge global economy into worst recession since World War II. It represents the deepest recession since the Second War, with the largest fraction of economies experiencing declines in per capita output since 1870, according to a recent World Bank report. Another thing I think we have to consider in our analysis in order to answer your 7 questions is that the interaction of, the international tax regime in the context of a global power shift. This is a paper I will be publishing in the Virginia Tax Review early next year. What I think is that the evolution of the international tax regime has been spiraled since about the 1908, when the first dispute on international taxation emerged. So the first stage is fundamentally a standardized regulation in which countries were basically dealing with regulations without a clear ex-ante meaning, so they were fundamentally standards. Countries were expected to agree on a case-by-case basis on how to allocate the tax base. The UK attempted to introduce a rule that was exclusive residence jurisdiction, because of course the UK was the home of the largest MNEs of the time. But after the first war, the UK was too weak to impose that exclusive residence jurisdiction in the League of Nations. So the UK was only able to impose that regulation in its tax treaty with Ireland. This first stage ended in 1933 when Mitchell Carroll produced the Carroll report that fundamentally introduced a rule in order to allocate the tax base of MNEs. That was the starting point of the second stage of the evolution, which is fundamentally rule-based. The US was strong enough to persuade all countries in the League of Nations, and then virtually all countries in the world, to transplant the arm's length principle to the international tax regime. And after a number of shocks, such as financial deregulation in the 80s, the emergence of technological shocks, such as the emergence of the fax and then the internet, this rule-based system somehow was eroded, and the US managed to control the evolution of this regulation until 2015, when the OECD and G20 produced the BEPS report. when the international tax regime moved back to its original structure, that is a standard-based regulation. What we can see here is that while the transition from the first stage to the second stage correlates with the global power shift from the UK to the US, the second transition from the standard-based regulation to rule-based regulation to standard-based one correlates with a global power shift from the US to China. So in terms of the COVID-19 impact on the third BAST, what I can see is a decline of physical globalization. Long value chains are somehow collapsing. And what is emerging in a very remarkable way is something that could be seen as virtual globalization. I think the UTD global tax talks are an example of a product of virtual globalization. And in this context, what we can see is the emergence of new technologies such as artificial intelligence and 3D printing. Another remarkable element that is part of the questionnaire today is the emergence of a global labor market without mobility. So, for example, Leandro and Celina could work from Buenos Aires for a client or an employer based in Shanghai or in New York or in London. And that is a result of remote working. And at the same time, this remote working market will increase global labor competition, because now it is possible to work in different parts of the world without any immigration restriction, thanks to, for example, Zoom, that allows Celina, Leandro to work wherever they can find a job. Now it is time to find a theory, I could say a new theory, to explain international taxation. And my core claim here is that a new logic has emerged in the strategic interaction existing between G20 countries and non-G20 nodes in the last century. G20 countries increasingly compete against each other for capital, just as private firms compete for market share. So what I can see is that while companies want to maximize their market share, countries want to maximize the attraction of capital. So I see an increasingly striking similarity in the behavior of countries and companies. This theory predicates that the international tax regime is fundamentally the result of the strategic interaction between two oligopolies. First, a collusive oligopoly of G20 OECD countries set up to protect their own international income tax base. And second, this OECD G20 oligopoly is being disrupted by a growing non-collusive oligopoly of non-G20 hubs. So at the end of the day, I think what we talk about when we talk about international taxation is the product of the interaction between these two oligopolies. A large one, the OECD G20 oligopoly, and a smaller one, which is constituted by non-G20 hubs. And the core structure of this interaction can be seen as a competition game. That is a game in which elements of cooperation and competition are somehow mixed. So what I argue here is that, Google is an example of a two-sided platform. So Google is here, it has created a platform that is the Google web search engine, and it has two different types of users on side one and users on side two. Users on side one are Celina, Leandro, myself, to say Google web searchers. And on side two, what we can see is Google advertisers, Coca-Cola, for example. At the same time, what we can see is a number of same-side network effects and cross-site network effects. An example of a same-side network effect is, for instance, the following. If Coca-Cola joins Google as a marketing vehicle, Pepsi-Cola will also have an incentive to join it in order not to grant Coca-Cola a comparative advantage. An example of cross-site network effect is the following. The more people are using Google as a web search engine, more companies will be willing to join this platform. So you may ask, what's the relationship between the two-sided platform and the international tax regime? And what I argue here, I argue this point in an Oxford Journal of Legal Studies paper, is that the international tax regime is fundamentally similar to Google in the sense that both are two-sided platforms. So here we can identify market leaders for quasi-legal rules, fundamentally the OECD and G20 countries. So the central countries in international trade, they have the incentive to cooperate to create a platform in order to maximize international trade and at the same time allow countries to collect some revenues, tax revenues. And that platform is the OECD model and unrelated documents. And this platform, as we saw before, have two different types of users. Users on side 1 and users on side 2. Users on side 1 are virtually all international taxpayers in the world who are looking for the best available location and industry where to invest in order to maximize their after-tax income. And users on side 2 are fundamentally all countries who are willing to use the OECD platform as a marketing vehicle in order to maximize the attraction of foreign direct investment, for example. So I think this is the core structure of the international tax regime, where this interaction with these two oligopolies is implemented. Now, let's see examples. So my point here is that in bilateral tax treaties that G20 countries conclude with non-G20 hubs, the latter serves as outlets for the bounded products that G20 countries offer to international investors. A component of the bundle is the tax treaty network in its interaction with relevant domestic laws, which serves as a vehicle to minimize tax entry cost and tax exit cost. So examples of this strategic interaction between G20 countries and non-G20 hubs include the interaction between Argentina and Chile, Brazil and the Netherlands, Canada and the Netherlands, China and Hong Kong, India and Mauritius, etc. So, for example, if a US investor is willing to invest in South Korea, the best available option would be to set up an entity in Belgium and to invest via an entity based in Belgium because of the following reason: the interaction of Belgium and South Korean domestic law with the tax treaty concluded between Belgium and South Korea allow this investor to minimize both the tax entry cost to South Korea and the exit cost from that country. Now, if we add additional data, so the evolving network of tax treaty dispute, this is something that Martin Harrison and I have published in a book recently. Here, what we can see is, okay, G20 countries are shown in black, non-G20 hubs are shown in gray. The size of each country's node indicates the average share of disputes in other G20 countries that relate to that country. So, for example, the size of the Swiss node represents tax treaty disputes involving the Swiss tax treaty network emerging before non-Swiss courts. The thickness of each line indicates the average share of G20 disputes involving the tax treaty network. A country location is determined using the technique of principal component analysis. Countries that play the most similar roles in the G20 dispute network are placed closest together. Countries at the edge present the greatest differences, but this includes countries with large number of disputes concerning their treaties which form poles. So in the 60s, what we can see is that presumably US investors willing to invest in South Africa did it via Switzerland. UK investors willing to invest in, let's see, in India did it via Sri Lanka. So in the 60s, Switzerland was the most important non-G20 hub. It was at the center of the world, of the international tax world. If we move to the 70s, okay, what we can see is the German pole, the US pole, and Switzerland still was the most relevant non-G20 hub, used by investors in order to minimize both the tax entry and tax exit cost. If we move to the 80s, so from the 80s onwards, the UK and India have gravitated towards the US pole, forming an Anglo-Saxon pole of countries more closely connected in a web of similar tax treaty disputes. What is fascinating here is the gradual emergence of competitors of Switzerland as non-G20 hubs. And I'm referring to the Netherlands as an incoming competitor of Switzerland as non-G20 hubs. If we move to the 60s, one striking element in the 90s is that the increasing number of countries joining the OECD tax treaty network. So as you can see, in the 60s, there were fundamentally about 35 countries who were members of the OECD legal technology. In the 90s, that number increased dramatically. Another striking element here is that in the 90s, or since the 90s, the Netherlands took over Switzerland as the main non-G20 hub. And in the 2000s, what we can see is that India created its own pole with tax treaty disputes different from the German pole and the Anglo-Saxon pole. And arguably, a very remarkable finding of this research is that virtually all G20 countries are circumventing 3 non-G20 hubs: the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland. So this is something that could be called the Copernican revolution, because one could think that G20 countries are at the center of the galaxy and non-G20 hubs, non-G20 low tax jurisdictions are circumventing G20 countries. But according to our research, the reality is exactly the opposite. All G20 countries are trying to sell themselves to international investors, fundamentally via non-G20 hubs. And in the 2000s, the leading non-G20 hubs were these 3, Netherlands, Switzerland, and Belgium. So let's take a further look to the non-G20 hub market. What I argue here is that this is a non-collusive oligopoly. So while the G20 world, OECD world, are members of a collusive oligopoly because they are trying to explicitly coordinate their actions in order to protect their own tax base, the non-G20 hub market, I think, is a non-collusive oligopoly because there is no explicit coordination between, for example, Switzerland and the Netherlands, or Switzerland and Singapore. It's non-collusive. It's an oligopoly, but non-collusive. And it is growing because it's a very, it could be very profitable market for certain type of countries to become non-G20 hubs. And due to the emergence of new technologies such as the internet, it is possible to interact for a multinational with a very distant non-G20 hub, because thanks to Zoom and similar technologies, I mean, distance is something that is not no longer relevant in international taxation. Now, I mean, you may ask, what is exactly the business of non-G20 hubs? And what I argue here is that the main business of non-G20 hub is fundamentally to link multinational enterprises with market jurisdictions. And one, I think, very clear example of that is the Apple Ireland case, in which Apple used, sorry, I say it again, Apple used Ireland as a gateway to Europe in order to sell its product. And by using this hub, this gateway to the European Union and beyond, allowed Apple to dramatically minimize its effective tax rate. So this is, I think, the core business model of non-G20 hubs. My final point here is something that I discovered by accident. Something that could be called non-G20 hubs, from G20 foes to G20 strategic partners. So in the 2000s, only about 30% of all leading tax treaty cases were between G20 and non-G20 hubs, and 70% were between G20 countries. So by the 2000, G20 countries were more willing to litigate against other G20 countries than against non-G20 hubs. So for example, France might be willing to litigate against the UK rather than Switzerland or Singapore. So what I infer here is that G20 countries are conveying a hidden message to the community of international investors, inducing them to get into a given G20 country via a non-G20 hub. That's why I argue that non-G20 hub are having a disruptive effect on the OECD legal technology, because OECD non-G20 hubs are somehow inducing large countries, such as India, somehow to defect from the OECD oligopoly. So my conclusion here is the following. My theory predicates that the international tax regime is fundamentally the result of a strategic interaction between two oligopolies. First, a collusive oligopoly of G20 and OECD countries set up to protect their international income tax base. And second, this OECD G20 oligopoly is in turn being disrupted by a growing non-collusive oligopoly of non-G20 hubs. This is my conclusion in relation to this theory based, as you see, on antitrust law. Now it's time to ask Leandro to ask his first challenging question.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. A very interesting point of view. And as you said, now we would like to go over our questions. And the first one refers to PE. During the lockdown, multinational enterprises have adapted rapidly. Some of their activities in other countries may have been performed without the need of any local presence, and home office has become the rule. It may no longer, as you said, be necessary to commute so often again. Assuming that the international tax system continues to be based on the source versus residence distinction, should the concept of PE be revisited and redefined? How? Should these changes apply exceptionally to certain industries, or should they become the general rule?
Thank you very much, Leandro. In order to answer your question, I would like to organize my words as follows. I would like to, first of all, take a look at PE disputes in the pre-BEPS era, then to take a look at the proposal from India. The third topic would be BEPS 2, particularly PR1, and finally, a potential connection between the new PE definition and some suggestions submitted by the United Nations. So here, what I'm trying to show is, okay, tax treaty disputes between G20 countries and non-G20 hubs in the 60s. So the first column refers to G20 countries, for example, France, Germany, US. The second column refers to non-G20 hubs, such as Barbados, Belgium, Netherlands, Sri Lanka, Switzerland. The third column refers to types of tax treaty disputes, for example, PE conflicts. And the fourth column refers to the outcome of those disputes. It could be for taxpayer, for government, and mixed. In the 60s, PE conflicts amounted to almost 12% of all tax treaty disputes emerging in the G20 world. And okay, in a substantial portion of those cases, the taxpayer prevailed. If we move to the 70s, PE conflicts were still quite relevant here. In the 80s, PE conflicts amounted 13.43% of all tax treaty disputes. And what is striking is that since the 80s, taxpayers started to massively win PE conflicts. So that suggests that the PE conflicts became relatively easy to manipulate by taxpayers since the 80s. In the 90s, PE conflicts amounted 10% of all tax treaty disputes, and again, in most cases, the taxpayer prevailed. And in the 2000s, PE conflicts amounted to almost 12% of all tax treaty disputes, and again, in most cases, the taxpayer prevailed. So this data, I think, shows that the PE conflict, particularly, I could say, Article 5, Paragraph 4, that relates to preparatory and auxiliary activities, was quite easy to manipulate, and that induced the G20 to pressure the OECD to amend the definition to expand the definition of PE. So what I can see from a historical perspective is that the hegemons and international taxation, they normally have similar preferences. What I can see is that the UK in the 20s and the US in the 2020s, the UK in 1920s and the US in 2020s, have demanded the same regulation of cross-border corporate income taxation, which is exclusive residence taxation. So what we can see is that the UK explicitly opposed to the PE concept in a crucial meeting at the League of Nations in 1928, and that opposition was submitted by Lord Joshua Stamp. The UK wanted exclusive residence jurisdiction on multinationals, and that is quite understandable. I mean, the UK was the location of the largest MNEs of the time, so rationally the UK wanted to tax multinationals exclusively on the residence basis. 100 years later, Stephen T. Munchin is implicitly defending the same argument that Lord Joshua Stamp had defended a century before, the opposition to PE reform. So the net effect of the opposition to the new version of the PE, as suggested by the BEPS report, is something quite similar to exclusive residence taxation, because the old version of the PE concept is according to the conventional wisdom and to the data I have just submitted, quite easy to manipulate. So what is fascinating here to see is that the hegemons of the international tax regime are rationally requesting a similar regulation, exclusive residence taxation. So in order to answer your question, Leandro, should the concept of PE be revisited and redefined? My answer is yes, because if that is not the case, the exclusive residence jurisdiction would prevail, and that would be clearly unfair to market jurisdictions. In terms of how, okay, my short response would be that there should be evolution towards more source taxation in the light, for example, of the UN Sustainable Development Goal as a benchmark. So we could use this proposal made by the UN called Sustainable Development Goal and try to formulate a new definition of PE to make it compatible with that benchmark. The suggestion made by the in BEPS 2, Pillar 1, called new nexus based on sales, could be a workable solution in many countries. But what I can see is that I see problems in countries with substantial black economies like Bolivia and Uganda. So it could be very hard to measure the volume of sales in Uganda and Bolivia in order to see if this new nexus is met or not. So this proposal by the G20, I think, does not work properly in countries with large black economies. So some solution should be considered in order to deal with that type of countries. I think the best available option is the one suggested by India, the concept of significant economic presence proposal, because it is more realistic and could be better than the new nexus based on sales, at least in countries with substantial black economies. Your next sub-question is, should these changes apply exceptionally to certain industries, or should they become the general rule? My feeling is that in order to avoid manipulations in the scope, with the scope of this new concept, it could be better to use the new concept as a general rule, probably in a new self-standing provision of all. Another, I think, amendment that should be introduced is in relation to Article 15 of the OECD model. It should be updated in order to protect source taxation of employment income, because the current version of Article 15 is quite easy to play with in order to virtually eliminate source taxation just by working via Zoom, for example, by not having physical presence in the country of source. So to make the story short, I think that both the PE concept and Article 15 should be amended in order to protect source taxation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, for this comprehensive answer. Very interesting that you include this quantitative approach and historical approach. Thank you very much. Now we can move to the next question. The next question is the following one. Is the current international tax system designed to attribute tax jurisdiction among states fairly, so that they can generate tax revenue to deal with situations like the COVID-19 pandemic effectively? Why? If this goal is not achieved with the current system, how could it be attained? Which line of policy should be followed to achieve this goal? Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Celina. Oh, this is a question dealing with a very challenging topic, which is global tax justice. So as Parto Shome said, the OECD model allocates tax jurisdiction based on capital ownership rather than value created by market jurisdiction. I think that is a very powerful argument. And as Parto said, arguably, this is something that could be called residual colonialism, because tax jurisdiction is based on capital ownership. And as Ruben and Andres also suggested, the emergence of G20 countries, where India and China are included, are somehow lobbying the OECD in order to challenge this residual colonialism. And I think that BEPS 2 is a wonderful example of this clear challenge to the residual colonialism that is implicitly encapsulated in the OECD model, because it still grants preeminent tax and rights to countries with capital ownership. Related to Celina's question, I think that it is very difficult to reach a global consensus on the meaning of global tax justice. There is currently a wonderful symposium on a monthly basis at Oxford University on global tax justice. There are a number of potential theories that could be used in order to define what's the meaning of global tax justice. But my feeling is that it will be extremely hard to find a definition of global tax justice that could reach global consensus. So my proposal would be to focus not on that concept, but on the concept of global Gini coefficient. So the focus, I think, should be on global Gini coefficient rather than global tax justice. And arguably, the global Gini coefficient could be used as a proxy for global tax justice. As you know, this coefficient, Gini coefficient, measures inequality So I think the new international tax system should be designed in such a way as to alleviate global inequality, as measured by the global Gini coefficient. So, for example, if, for example, in certain part of Africa or Latin America, the Gini coefficient goes up in year 1, on year 2, the global minimum corporate tax rate could be increased in a global coordinated way as to deal with rising inequality in, for example, North Africa or North Latin America. So I think that we should think on how to link the international tax regime with the Gini coefficient in order to try to use this system to alleviate global inequality. Because this is, my proposal is based on a number of considerations. One of those considerations is that when the relevant inequality rises above certain threshold, normally that brings political instability, civil wars. So there, I think, should be an aligned interest between developed and developing countries in order to minimize the number of social unrest. And one way to anticipate that political instability would be by focusing on the Gini coefficient and linking that data to, for example, the minimum corporate income tax rate. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you for answering this very difficult question, or providing your point of view of how to deal with this issue of global tax justice. Now we move back to the current system, okay? And the question is whether this pandemic is an opportunity to shift the current international tax system, to set aside the source and residence concepts, and then if they are set aside, if they are replaced, which should the substitutes be, okay, and why? Is there a role for the digital services tax in this shift? What is your opinion, Eduardo?
Leandro, thank you very much. Let me take your last question first. What is the role of digital service tax in this shift? And I would like to use the theory submitted today in order to answer that question. My feeling is that digital service tax suggests the implosion of the collusive OECD G20 oligopoly. And as a consequence of that, unilateralism may prevail over multilateralism in the current third bust. So what the digital service tax, I think, suggests is that countries are willing, they are so desperate to increase tax collection that they are willing to defect this global collusive oligopoly, because this is a very, challenging situation. Countries need to increase their revenues, and they are willing so to abandon multilateralism as a way for trying to make and meet. In relation to the more fundamental part of your question, I fundamentally agree with the proposals submitted by Professor Andrés Baez Moreno, Parto Shome, and Ruben Avillona when answering this question. My sole addition would be the following. I think it would be good to regulate tax competition, because according to the data I have submitted today, countries are already in a very clear competition model. So there is a very stiff competition out there. So we need somehow to regulate tax competition. So my understanding is that the best available regulation on tax competition is the one offered by the European Union. So my proposal would be to use EU state aid transplanted to all countries on a voluntary basis, in order to allow countries to show in a credible way that they are not willing to use their tax system as a subsidy offered to multinationals. in order to have a fairer competition that would prevent countries from using their tax system to offer subsidies to MNEs. As I suggested a couple of minutes ago, I think that it would be good to establish a link the tax rate of minimum global corporate income taxation, as suggested in Pillar 2, to global inequality, and to increase or decrease that minimum global corporate tax rate according to global inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. And thirdly, transform MAPs, APAs, and tax arbitration as laboratories for the creation of new regulations. So, for example, all countries related to the OECD should have the duty to inform the OECD, for example, the results of MAPs, APAs, and tax arbitration, and the OECD could have the duty to identify global trends, for example, on how to construe Article 5, Paragraph 1, and as soon as there is a regional or global trend, in the light of MAPs, APAs, and tax arbitration, to transplant that convergence to the commentary to Article 5, Paragraph 1, in order to create a clear interaction between the wording of the OECD model and decisions made by local judges or arbitrators. So as you can see, these three proposals are fully compatible with the proposals made by Ruben, Parto, and Andres when answering question 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. In the beginning of your presentation, you said that we are facing a current third bust. So the question is, in this new context, transfer pricing. As you know, this pandemic affects the multinational intercompany transactions comparability. So the question is, which are the challenges and possible solutions to determine the arm's length range during this economic downturn?
I think, Celina, you are absolutely right that this major shock is producing a number of issues in transfer pricing. What I will do now is to identify some of those issues. Issues. Does the normal assumption that limited risk entities should derive stable profits remain valid in the light of the crisis? Should royalties and services payments still be made, particularly if the payer is in financial difficulty? A third issue is, where within the group should shutdown or conversion or restructuring costs be borne? The next issue is, how should government support or subsidies be treated, and might the benefits accrue to entities outside the jurisdiction in which any governmental support is received? So to what extent a subsidy granted by the Chilean government could benefit an entity based in Papua New Guinea? How are internal financing arrangements affected? Should existing APAs be modified or suspended because of the dramatic changes in circumstances? And finally, might transfer pricing arrangements in the current environment give rise to BEPS opportunities or lead to some MNEs gaming tax rules for dealing with losses? So as you can see, and as you correctly stated, Celina, there are many issues emerging from the application of the arm's length principle as defined in the OECD guidelines in the current dramatic scenario. What I can see is that the OECD guidelines is based on assumptions that are simply wrong at the present. So the OECD guidelines assumed a functioning market as providing a yardstick for its operation. So in the absence of such a functioning free market, for example, in the context of a market where survival rather than profit is the immediate goal, it becomes increasingly difficult to apply the guidelines. On top of that, financial data from the current period is unlikely to become available till late 2021. So my point here to answer your question is that the OECD guidelines are largely not useful to address the new issues emerging from the pandemic. So there is a quite important room for creativity, extrapolation, because the OECD guidelines were written for another world, not this one. So the level of uncertainty will be high, and in the developed world, one possibility would be to submit all these doubts to the relevant jurisdiction and request a map. That could be a bilateral map or trilateral map, and try to solve these issues in the context of a negotiation between the relevant tax authorities. In part of the world where there is no tradition of map or APA, such as South America, that could be harder. So the obvious prediction is that the volume of transfer pricing disputes will increase dramatically because of the uncertainty on how to apply the OECD guidelines to the current scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Very interesting point of view. It seems that like a contract, maps, I'm sorry, APAs may have to be revisited between the contracting parties. Whether force majeure applies in this case.
Fully agree with that.
Not to comply with or not to fulfill this agreement. Let's move to our fifth question, which relates to wealth taxation. Okay. As we have heard and we know, many countries are discussing the convenience of levying a wealth tax to collect revenues to afford the economic strains created by the pandemic. Would such a tax be a solution, or could it create more problems in the future? Would developing countries benefit from levying such a tax, considering that their resident high net worth individuals may have moved their assets elsewhere, not only for tax reasons, but also because of political instability or absence of the rule of law in their residence countries? In other words, if developed countries were to levy a wealth tax, residents of developing jurisdictions with investments in developed countries may be subject to wealth tax outside their residence jurisdictions. If a foreign tax credit were to be granted, actual collections may be low, and the lack of mechanism to avoid double taxation may make the tax confiscatory. In that case, could a wealth tax create more tensions and disparities between rich and poor countries? How could rich countries help the poor ones?
Thank you very much, Leandro. On this question, I fully agree with the responses submitted by Professor Ruben Avellona and Professor Bartoszon. There should be a high threshold, particularly focusing on the super rich, low tax rate, and multilateral harmonization to deal with issues such as double taxation. My feeling is that probably one of the most challenging difficulties that humanity is currently facing is increasing inequality. That is triggering electoral shocks such as Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil. So we have to do whatever we can in order to address the problem of increasing inequality. And I think wealth taxation could be one avenue to get there. At the same time, I think we have to take into account when designing net wealth taxation, the Spanish experience as presented, as outlined by Professor Andrés Báez Moreno. So in order to prevent avoid designing a wealth taxation system that could deal with problems similar to the one faced by the Spanish wealth tax system. So we have to learn from Spanish mistakes in relation to this tax and ground this tax based on these three pillars. That is my proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. So we can move to the next question, which is connected to the previous one. And the question is the following. How do you think that the taxpayer may react in general to any potential tax increases resulting from the pandemic? Could their government's approach to deal with the pandemic have any implications in terms of tax reform and taxpayer willingness to accept a tax hike?
Thank you, Celina. Okay, I think this tax hike will probably create an incentive on the super rich to migrate to non-G20 hubs, like Uruguay in South America, Switzerland in Europe, Singapore in Asia. So there could be a stampede of super rich to non-G20 hubs. So one potential reaction, as submitted by Professor Abellona to deal with this issue, could be exit taxes, as the US has done. So at the end of the day, we have to focus on the relevance of taxpayers' rights based on international law and constitutional law in order to deal with potential abuses by countries when trying to somehow limit or block this stampede of super rich to global non-G20 or regional non-G20 hubs. So my understanding is that international law and constitutional law could be gain renewed relevance in order to identify the taxpayers' rights as applied to their potential reaction to this tax hike. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. We are getting to our final question, our seventh and last, which is which relates to the solutions that we have been seeing implemented so far. Because the question is whether this pandemic requires policymakers to think out of the box to find new collaborative solutions, to help the poorer countries. In other words, do poorer countries have a claim to receive tax revenues from richer countries to help them cope with crises like COVID-19?
All right. Okay, going straight to the first part of your question, I don't think that poorer countries have a claim to receive tax revenues from richer countries. As Professor Sean said, developed countries are dealing with their own dramatic fiscal crisis. So it is very unlikely that developed countries would be willing to make transfers to developing countries. So my response to that, to tax refunds, is that it is very unlikely. What is more likely is that loans and or grants by the IMF, World Bank, and similar institutions from, for example, China, should be available. And what I can see is that, yes, these international institutions seem to be willing to help developing countries deal with the effects of the pandemic. On top of that, I think that more source taxation, for example, digital service taxes and Article 12A of the UN model version 2017 could be good options in order to give developing countries more source taxation. I do remember that Professor Adams in the 20s and in the 30s, Professor Adams from Yale University, was the leading figure in the League of Nations negotiations, wanted to grant continental European countries source tax jurisdiction in order to allow them to rebuild themselves after the First World War. I think something similar should be applied to developing countries in the current tragedy. So more source taxation could be an additional element. And your second question, your following question, if that is the case, what kind of obligations could be imposed on those countries interested in such systems? And I think that, okay, a credible plan submitted by the relevant country, monitored by the UN or a similar institution, could be probably a good system in order to induce developing countries to use that grants and loans effectively. And how could raw countries be dealt with? I think, a similar system to that suggested to developing countries, I think should be applied to raw countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Now, if you agree, we can move to the question from our audience. The first question is, How do you envision the global tax war and consensus in 10 years' time?
It's extremely difficult to predict that because as we discussed an hour ago, we are in the middle of globalization 3 and the still distant globalization 4. And on top of that, there is a war between a rising power, China, and a declining power, the US. So there are so many elements to consider that is extremely difficult to predict. But if you ask me to make a prediction, I would say that the world would probably move back to where we were before 1933. So we will live in a period of competition between incompatible regulations, triggering international double taxation. So at some point, a new League of Nations should emerge, probably after the start of the fourth globalization. If you ask me further, my hunch would be that this new regulation would include a regulation of tax competition along the line suggested by the EU in the area of EU state aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Another question that we have received refers to the paradox within G20 between keeping the prevalence of the residence principle and reinforcing sourcing rights to tax digital economy, and your general claim of conflict of two major oligopolies. In this case, would the UN be the best setting to try to reach a global alignment?
Thank you very much for that. As Professor Andrés Báez Moreno said, after the last big financial crisis in 2009, developed countries realized that they were also source countries, because an increasing number of multinationals have moved to their headquarters to non-G20 hubs. So what is a paradox is that developing countries and developed countries suddenly transform themselves into source jurisdictions, while residence jurisdictions massively moved to non-G20 hubs. So as you can see, the increasing number of multinationals setting up their European corporations in the Netherlands, Ireland, and comparable countries. So somehow, the interests of developing countries and developed countries are somehow aligned. And my understanding is that the best available expertise in the area of tax policy making is at the OECD. So, but China and India are not part of the OECD. They are part of the G20. So my feeling is that there should be a good interaction between the G20, the UN, and the OECD. So somehow the G20 and the UN should agree on what to do, how to design the new tax system, and to ask the OECD to write down the technical details. Because if you see the difference between BEPS 1 and BEPS 2, it's a remarkable difference. BEPS 2 is a substantial amendment is introducing substantial amendment to the international tax regime, I think because of pressure from India and China. So the beauty of the G20 is that the new emerging countries are represented in the G20. If we could invite the UN to join this group of OECD and G20, the tax system will gain more credibility and inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. We have other question from other audience. To what extent do you think are the international tax treaties and standards the result of bilateral power and negotiations, which in turn makes cooperation and standardization of law difficult?
As Professor Shom suggested, the OECD model is fundamentally encapsulated a colonialist legal system because it grants preeminent tax jurisdiction to the country of residence. So since these are the countries that normally have the capital, developing countries have no other better option than joining the tax treaty network. So there is, I think, a large prisoner's dilemma that explains the success of the OECD model in the world. But now, because of the pressure of China and India, I think the OECD model will be transformed substantially over the next couple of decades in order to, yes, to give more tax jurisdiction to the country of source that would potentially make the system more stable, because now the tax treaty network is under a very quite unstable equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Our final question refers to something that we have been discussing in the previous talks, but now, which is the role of certain countries or regions of the world in the design of the future international tax system. Which is your opinion about the role that Latin America may play in designing this new international tax system?
Very challenging question as well. Latin America is probably the most unequal part of the world, even more unequal than Africa. And my understanding is that in order to increase the bargaining power of Latin America should join either the US or the European Union or Chinese forces, because Latin America on its own, I think, is not powerful enough to influence the evolution of the international tax system unless it joins with the other central players, I think, which are the US, the European Union, and China and India. So that I think could be, I think, a potential way forward. Something compatible with that proposal would be to if Latin America joins somehow the BRICS countries group, let's say Brazil, China, Russia, and India, and work together, try to reach a consensus with the BRICS countries, and then submit that proposals to the G20, and from the G20 to the OECD. So, so now that I'm considering a number of options, probably one good option would be for Latin America to join the BRICS countries group, make an agreement on fundamental issues, and then submit their agreements to the G20 in order to persuade the US and the European Union with their proposals. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eduardo. If you could stop sharing your screen, we would appreciate it, because we have finalized our dialogue with you. We have been very pleased to share this time with you. Thank you very much for your answers. We are ending our fourth talk. Next week, we'll be dialoguing with Professor Martin Herson, a political scientist. Definitely, we'll have a different point of view to our questions next week. So please join us at the same tax time on the same tax channel. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, wear your tax masks. Till next week. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Celina. We'll see each other soon.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, Celina and Leandro, for this wonderful opportunity. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Eduardo. Bye-bye.
Bye.